No single work of African art in any Western museum appeared out of thin air. There's always an artist at the beginning of the process.
As the call for the repatriation of African artifacts taken during war and colonialism intensifies in Europe and the United States, a new narrative is emerging about ownership and cultural identity.
Cultural artifacts which were wrenched from their homes have still not, in the main, been returned to their original owners.
The question, though, the fierce debate that has been going on for decades, should they stay in these museums or go back to their place of origin?
There's a vast difference between restitution and repatriation.
I think one has a soul, one doesn't.
Restitution needs to occur as a redefining of the relations between Africa and the West, recognizing the impact of Western violence on Africa.
Repatriation, you can actually give things back without being remorseful. Restitution is putting soul and remorse into the process.
Africans are cut off from their historical origins. It's okay for African cultural objects to be in Western museums, but it's not okay for Africans to have no ability to access their cultural objects because it's in Western museums.
This is your history. We should be able to have control over how these works are seen or how they're displayed. Being able to feel like you're in control of something, despite the fact that it was taken from you not in the best circumstance. Then you begin to see like a new sense of consciousness, a new sense of pride.
Every year, millions of people walk through museums to see stolen art. What you don't always see is the stories of how those objects got there and what got lost along the way. And it forces us to ask, who gets to own culture and who decides what counts as art? We're here in New York City, and today we're going to visit two major museums, the Met and the Brooklyn Museum, to see cultural objects that tell this story. We'll follow the journeys of objects from shrines to auction houses to museum galleries, meet the experts who are changing the field, and ask tough questions about ownership, power, and cultural wealth. We'll see how an extractive system was built and how it's being challenged today. We'll end with the present, the movement for restitution, and what it means to bring these objects home. Think of this as a behind-the-scenes look at a century-long con. Before we dive deeper, I should introduce myself. My name is Reilly Clark. I'm a PhD student in the history of art and architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I study repatriation, restitution, and museum practice with Professor Sylvester Akwamada-Ogbeche. I'm also a practicing art appraiser and a repatriation professional. I help return stolen objects to their communities of origin, and I work regularly with the art market. I want to be clear, I am not an expert in African art, but I am invested in unveiling the extractive systems behind our favorite institutions and asking, how can we challenge them? When I walk through the Met, I can't help but wonder how the art got here. This figure, for example, was never meant to be admired for its clean lines. It was a reliquary guardian that watched over the bones of an ancestor. This is Nyema Bayeri, created by the Fang people of Equatorial Guinea. It protected against grave robbers and malevolent spirits. The irony? It was robbed, and now sits behind glass at the Met. The Met capitalized on its pure visual forms, the expressive mask-like face, the proportion of the arms and legs, and the elongated, elegant body. It's presented as a sculpture, as a work of art with a capital A. But if not art, what is it really? The figure was literally made to protect the ancestors from grave robbers and malevolent spirits. When Equatorial Guinea was still a Spanish colony, however, it was separated from its shrine and entered into European hands. It was robbed, reframed, and sold as art.
Authenticity is never a question that arises in indigenous contexts of use. The question of authenticity begins at the point where the artwork leaves its context of production and moves into the global market as a commodity. For an object to end up in a museum, it passes through a provenance process. It's exhibited in many places, it's owned by several kinds of people, and all that information then follows it into a museum setting where it becomes legitimized as part of the canon.
The first time this figure appears in the historical record is 1930 at the Galerie Pigalle in Paris. The exhibition was curated by Tristan Tzara, a surrealist artist, and Charles Raton, a dealer who had defined a market for African art. To build that market, Raton needed expertise, a legal title in France that gave him the authority to organize auctions. Raton needed to create a sense of authenticity. He did this by insisting that objects like the Fang reliquary guardian figure had the right kind of provenance, that it was acquired by a European and transferred from European to European in an unbroken chain of ownership.
Provenance is a record of an object's movement and history of ownership. The provenance of the object is related to its value in the West, which is divorced completely from its indigenous context of practice. Provenance is a function of the art market. It answers to the art market. It doesn't answer to scholarship per se.
Provenance devalued African ownership by default, and it enhanced the claims of authenticity that Raton made to collectors. Raton insisted that objects like this Bayeri were properly vetted, that they had the right pedigree. These words and ideas come from the breeding of racehorses, further dehumanizing the original owners of the sculpture. Here's Raton's playbook. Step 1, become an expert. In France, this wasn't just about knowledge. It was a legal license to organize auctions and make money. Step 2, establish authenticity. But authentic to Raton meant owned by Europeans. African ownership actually made things less valuable. The irony is brutal. Today, this sculpture is on display at the Met, where many of the same underlying assumptions still apply. An object that was taken from its original cultural context and ancestral shrine, transformed into a commodity for sale, and displayed in such a way that refuses any power that it might have, or that the indigenous communities that created it might have in the present day. The irons and collar around the ankles and neck take on new sinister meanings in this new context. The words primitive art even appear from an old exhibition at the base. Not much has changed in the last century. It's Raton's world, and we're all just living in it. Now, let's head to the Brooklyn Museum. The museum is currently closed its African art galleries, but I got a special access to see these objects. This tusk and brass base comes from a royal altar in the Kingdom of Benin. In 1897, the British invaded the Kingdom of Benin, toppled the Oba, or king, and looted thousands of cultural objects. Soldiers photographed piles of ivories and bronzes, proudly labeling them loot. Benin bronzes are the textbook examples of European looting and art theft in colonial Africa. These objects were, materially and culturally, the wealth of Benin. They were the sovereign wealth fund for the kingdom, created by bronze casting guilds under the patronage of the Oba. The Oba spent double-digit percentages of the royal revenues on these works of art. The Benin bronzes, then, were a literal store of value for the kingdom.
This is a really complex history, and in not taking that history into consideration and just reading the Benin bronzes as cultural products, no matter how detailed the analysis you put to these objects are, it doesn't solve the problem. that the provenance divests the original producers of any claim to the value that the work has.
Take this metal base and tusk at the Brooklyn Museum, which was once part of Rattan's collection. The leopards in the base project outwards towards the viewer, and the carved tusk fits neatly into it, so that it could stand upright at the ancestral shrine of D'mba. In Rattan's system, however, it was a Western name, like his, that conferred real value. Ownership, not origin, made an object museum-worthy, which is why it sits here today. Most looted bronzes went to the British Museum. Others trickled into private collections. Augustus Pitt Rivers bought a plaque for just £24, about $5,400 today. Today, similar plaques are worth hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars. Think about that. In 1897, these works of art were worth next to nothing to the men who looted them. Now, they're worth millions of dollars. What changed? Charles Rattan. That transformation was Rattan's coup. He reframed stolen goods as masterpieces of African art. These objects, and the revenue that they generate from museums, are the central points of repatriation claims today, both from the modern nation of Nigeria and the reigning Oba of Benin, Iwari II, the great-grandson of the deposed king. In 1931, Rattan organized an auction at Hotel Drouot for what he called the primitive arts. Rattan recruited surrealist artists like André Breton and Paul Éluard to lend credibility to the auction. Collectors might not buy from unknown Africans, but they would buy from European names they recognized. Objects like this Kota reliquary, or Mbulu Ngulu, once protected shrines in Gabon and the Republic of Congo. Europeans prized their fanned, metal-faced forms. Dealers like Rattan photographed them into pure abstraction. The process turned living cultural objects into commodities. In the words of the great decolonial writer, Aimé Césaire, colonization equals thingification.
Every single African cultural object was an object of economic transaction in the first place. And by denying the value of the object, the economic value of the object in its site of production, and transferring that value to its provenance, which is in the site of its reception, you essentially, mask the fact that the mass looting, plunder, and relocation of African objects to the West constituted a mass transfer of economic wealth from Africa to the West.
By 1935, Rattan's methods had crossed the Atlantic. On display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, this D'mba performance mask, created by the Baga people of modern-day Guinea, was reduced to pure visual form, a sculpture to be consumed by American modern art lovers. This transformation from performance mask to commodity was helped along by the medium of photography. MoMA hired the photographer Walker Evans to reframe objects like this as simple modernist sculptures, works of art to be appreciated by American museum goers. Evans titled this work simply African Sculpture. Other objects were photographed in the same way, stripped of their original cultural meanings and reframed as modernist sculptures. MoMA's exhibition catalog minimized the importance of original context, but had pages and pages of collectors' names to add market value. White Western ownership begot white Western ownership. Money begot money.
It is the transformation of African realities into exploitable capital. That's the big problem. Slavery is at the foundation of the modern capitalist system, but unfolded alongside that was the conversion of African cultural production, cultural heritage into capital.
Through reliquary guardians, bronzes and masks, an entire system was built. Dealers created markets, museums legitimized them, and Africa's cultural wealth was exported to the West. Nearly a century later, many of these same protocols still exist. Rattan set the terms. Museums eagerly participated, and Africa's cultural wealth flowed west. That system didn't just disappear. It's still shaping what we see in museums today. If we step back into the Met, then what we see is striking. Many of the very same objects that Rattan handled stand before us a century later. They appear much as they would have in Paris or New York almost 100 years ago, isolated on pedestals, transformed into timeless art objects, separated from their original contexts, rituals, and communities. The protocols that Rattan helped invent, authenticity, provenance, the right kind of ownership, continue to define how these objects are valued and exhibited today. What looks like neutral museum practice is in fact the continuation of a system that extracts African cultural wealth and consolidates it in the West.
The thing was not stolen and kept somewhere. The thing was stolen and exhibited and used to also generate foot traffic to the museum.
But it doesn't have to be this way. Today, independent African nations are demanding the return of their cultural heritage.
Simply pack them up and send them back to the rightful owners.
This doesn't just mean the return of objects. It means the return of interpretive control and economic control. And it's happening.
A Dutch museum is taking a historic step, sending more than 100 precious artifacts back to Nigeria. The Wereld Museum in Leiden is preparing a collection of Benin bronzes looted during a violent British raid in 1897. This marks the largest single return of these treasures to date.
Nigerian institutions have long campaigned to bring the Benin bronzes home from Western museums. Germany handed over around 20 of them back in 2022, and some have also been returned from UK galleries.
After decades of cultural displacement, a significant chapter in history is being rewritten. 119 Benin bronzes, some of the most iconic symbols of Nigeria's heritage, are back on home soil. Their return marks a significant moment in Nigeria's ongoing efforts to reclaim its looted heritage.
You know, we've always been clamoring for these objects to return back to the country.
It's a day in which a wrong from the past can be corrected, and it's about time, we would say.
This isn't just symbolic. The bronzes were the sovereign wealth fund for the Kingdom of Benin. Returning them is part of a larger project of economic revitalization, reparations, and the redistribution of cultural wealth. Returning these objects galvanizes the Bronze Casting Guild, which still exists in Benin City today. It brings tourism dollars to the city rather than directing them to London or New York. This tusk and base embodies that story. Ancestral Shrine, Loot, Rattan's Market, Brooklyn. The question is, will it ever return? Nigeria is preparing for that return. As we speak, the country is building a new Museum of West African Art in Benin City, just minutes from the Oba's Palace. This museum promises to hold the art and cultural objects of Benin in Benin after more than a century in exile.
For me as a gallerist that works with young, emerging artists, it is important for them to sort of know the history of the artists that have come before them. They're able to engage in it in a different way. It's inspirational. You know, they can see that my ancestor was able to create something like this. It's one thing to see it online, but being able to see it in person, I think, is really important.
What I would like to see is for this conversation to continue in a way where the story is told beyond our lifetime, the amplification of the culture, of the dialogue, cultural traditions and production and spirituality of African art to be told beyond this generation and for posterity, beyond these walls.
Even the Met has returned plaques. 2 bronzes, looted in 1897, accessioned in Britain, and later returned to Nigeria. But they were taken, again, from Nigeria's National Museum, sometime between 1950 and 1991. they reappeared on the international art market and ended up at the Met through a donation by Klaus Perls, the son of European art dealers. Only later did the Met realize that these had been recently taken and returned them again to Nigeria. Rattan established the importance of provenance, a chain of Western ownership defining value. When the owner was an African nation, Nigeria, that ownership was devalued. These objects embody that entire history, looted, anonymized, laundered, and finally returned. The return of these objects is a start, but it's just a start. Many more remain in Western museums where they are still defined by Rattan's protocols. Yet change is happening, not from dealers in London, Paris, or New York, but from African scholars, curators, and communities reclaiming their cultural capital. These objects were never just art. They were shrines, treasuries, conduits for cultural memory. For too long, they've been trapped in a system that prizes markets over meaning. But that system is finally starting to crack, and objects in exile are finally going home. With each and every return, a different decolonial and decommodified future comes into focus.
It's not about returning the objects, it's about giving them a space where they will continue to have dignity, respect, and context now and beyond.